Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's daily global COVID-19 show. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this daily conversation around all things COVID-19. Today is episode 182. We've been on the air for 6 months and 2 days every single day of those 6+ months. Today's topic is privacy's perfect storm. We have a very special guest for you. Stuart Brotman is with us. He's on Twitter at Stuart N. Brotman, and on LinkedIn, he's just Brotman. He's the author of Privacy's Perfect Storm, Digital Policy for Post-Pandemic Times. He's the Howard Distinguished Endowed Professor of Media Management and Law and the Beaman Professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. This show touches upon various aspects of the COVID-19 crisis, and today we're focused on digital privacy. And you will meet Stuart in just a minute. Please tag and share your friends. Share this with your friends right now. Hi, everybody. I'm Sree. I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at Stony Brook School of Journalism and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consulting business. Our motto: don't cancel your event without talking to us, and don't start planning your virtual event without talking to us as well. My email address is right here. We love making events for other people. We've done events for 50 and for 100,000 people. We presume your event is somewhere between those two numbers. We're live right now on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. Please hit share and please tag your friends so they can join us. In our first 175 episodes, we've had more than 1 million viewers, 129 million social impressions, more than 300 guests, 185 of them women, from 63 cities and 17 countries, including the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. We're in partnership with Scroll In and Scroll Global. Our archives are at youtube.com/Sreenet. We're able to produce this show because of our awesome sponsors, who we will thank in a few minutes, as well as our awesome producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31 and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. Please follow them so that you can thank them for the amazing work that they do. Are you ready to talk digital privacy? I know I am. Our guest is here, Stuart Brotman, Professor Brotman, author of Privacy's Perfect Storm, Digital Policy for Post-Pandemic Times. So let's bring Stuart and get some learning on. Hello, sir. How are you?
Great. How are you?
Thank you for being here. My first question always, how are you doing? Where are you? And how's your family through the pandemic?
Thank you for asking. I'm doing fine. My family's doing fine. My family is all around the world, or at least my kids are. So I have a son in Brooklyn, I have a daughter in Los Angeles, and I have a son in Johannesburg. But tonight I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. The academic year has begun. I'm teaching remotely. I have 85 students, and I'm teaching media law and ethics, and it's been quite an interesting experience.
Well, you're one of the world's leading scholars and experts on media and media law and where we are on so many aspects of the media landscape. But you are also just published a book about digital privacy, and such a timely title about post-pandemic time. So tell us how the book came together, and tell us what we'll find in it. We'll also put in a link so that people can order the book at Amazon and their favorite independent bookstores.
Great. So last year I had the privilege of being awarded a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I took a research leave from the university, moved to Washington, D.C., and had the privilege to essentially spend 24/7 thinking about and talking to people about digital privacy policy. And I was really in the epicenter, both geographically and intellectually, because within probably a 2 or 3 mile radius, virtually everyone thinking about digital privacy, at least in the United States, was located. So there were obviously people from Congress and the White House, virtually all of the tech companies and other companies and trade associations had their offices right around the offices of the Wilson Center, which is dead set in Washington. It's in the Reagan International Building. Obviously, think tanks, research institutions. And so I had really unfettered access to all of these people and would meet with them and talk with them. And then I had the wonderful physical environment of the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the only think tank that is funded by the United States Congress. And it gets about a third of its funding from Congress, about 2/3 from the private sector. But because of that, it has a really special place in the Washington think tank world. And it's the only institution other than Congress which has unlimited access to the Library of Congress. So literally, I had a Library of Congress card where I could take out books. Typically, you're not allowed to take out books. It's a collection you could go to, but I could do that. As a result of this fellowship, I really was able to immerse myself in an area I've been quite conversant and active in for years, but this really gave me the luxury and the ability to do it full time, just to think about digital privacy, to talk to the people involved in it, and hopefully to begin to make some recommendations in this area. So I really came in looking to establish what I call a 360-degree view. I didn't want to necessarily look at this solely as a legislator or solely as a tech company problem or solely a research problem. I wanted to try to take in as many perspectives as possible. And to that extent, I was somewhat like a travel guide because I was in this territory and wanted to be able to tell people what I was seeing and what I was thinking. So every week, I was at the Wilson Center for 36 weeks. Every week, I researched, wrote, and published a new article. So at the end of that period, I had 36 articles, and certainly in March 13th, I think was the exact date, the Wilson Center, like so many other places, shut down physically. We continued to operate remotely, and I did so until the end of my fellowship around Memorial Day. So about a third of my focus of those 36 articles was on COVID-19, and the implications for my thinking and writing really changed in terms of looking at this through a COVID-19 lens. And so then I had these 36 articles. I decided then to put them together as a collection. I updated them. I worked with an editor, did a pretty large introduction, and then had the privilege of having the former chairman of the FCC, Newton Minow, write the introduction to the book. And so now there physically is a collection which is called Privacy's Perfect Storm. And you can think of it almost like a guidebook, like a photos book or some sort of guide if you want to try to get a sense of what's happening in the digital world and also what we might be doing in this area.
Well, this is great. Iman, who is tweeting, says, I'm watching Sree and really need to hear this topic, and this is really relevant. I'm struggling with this issue of digital privacy now, and so she's watching from Chicago. And we have lots of other people watching as well, and we'll do a global tour, and we're so glad to hear that your family is okay in different parts of the U.S. You said you have kids in Brooklyn, LA, and Joburg. That's an unusual combination, and you yourself are in Knoxville, Tennessee. Folks, we're talking to Stuart Brotman, leading scholar and expert on the media, and he's written a book about digital privacy and what we need to know. Among the quotes here about his book, here's Sandra Baer saying, this book is must reading for three important reasons. First, Stuart Brotman's research and analysis keeps us up to date on the complexities of this political and social privacy debate. Second, his thoughtful recommendations are actionable and should move policymakers worldwide to move collaboratively, transparently, and urgently, and perhaps most importantly, Brotman poses the difficult questions we all should be asking to clarify who's in charge, who'll enforce digital privacy, and how will we ever feel truly safe in the post-COVID-19 digital world. That is quite the endorsement there. So we want people to buy the book to learn all the answers, but let's at least pick one of those questions and you can do a little bit of a deep dive into it. If it's okay, I'll pick the question about how do we stay safe in the privacy with regards to privacy in post-pandemic times. First of all, Stuart, will there be post-pandemic times?
I believe there will be. I hope there will be. And I think that all of us are optimistic that there will be post-pandemic times. So clearly, like most other areas, I think we as a society, not just the United States, have to begin thinking about that transition from pandemic to post-pandemic whenever that takes place. And so that's part of my focus, which is not just to look at the current crisis, but the implications for that crisis after it gets mitigated in some way. So let me start at least talking about the perfect storm and bring it up to COVID-19. What is the perfect storm? So when I first got to Washington, the first element of the perfect storm already was in motion, and that was in Europe. So Europe in May of 2018 enacted the first really major comprehensive data privacy legislation that applied at that point to all 28 European countries. This is pre-Brexit. And essentially, it forced a new regime, which all the individual states would have, for digital privacy. And that was the first sort of shot in the bow here in terms of clouds that were starting to form around what would be happening in this area. And then in the United States, the state of California enacted its own privacy legislation. I'm not going to use a lot of acronyms, but I will at least tell you what they are and then tell you the full name. So the European regulation is called the General Data Privacy Regulation, the GDPR. And in California, a separate piece of legislation was enacted called the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA. And that looked to some of the things that had been done in Europe and tried to adapt it to the state of California. It had some differences. If you were to do a quick comparison, Europe is far more expansive in terms of protecting data privacy. For example, California exempts the government and their data collection and distribution mechanisms from its law. It also exempts not-for-profit organizations. But if you look to Europe, Europe says data is data if it comes from government, if it comes from the private sector, if it comes from a not-for-profit, it still should be protected in the same way. So the second element of the perfect storm actually occurred when I was at the Wilson Center, January 1 of this year, 2020. The CCPA took effect. And so now we had two major storm clouds, if you will, dealing with data privacy. And then, of course, in March, we had, obviously earlier than that, but in terms of its impact, in March, certainly COVID-19 hit. And so I say that the three major elements of privacy's perfect storm are the Gdpr and the CCPA and then COVID-19. So they all have these acronyms, and that combination, I think, really is the combination we need to be looking at in terms of both what's happening in the pandemic and certainly in post-pandemic times.
Thank you for that great introduction. There are so many things that we worry about as people just trying to go about our daily lives. We're worried now about misinformation, disinformation. We're worried about phishing. We're worried about our privacy when it comes to how people see our information, and then all these tech platforms. So how does one decide even how to start thinking about this? I I know there are some people, when it comes to privacy, just like, there's no point, we can't do anything about it. It's all being tracked anyway. So let's just kind of put our heads in the sand, or just like pretend nothing's wrong. What is your answer to someone like that?
Well, I like to start with data, and at least to see how people are perceiving this. And there are a number of good surveys and other data that at least can begin to guide us. So very recently, the professional services firm KPMG released a study, a survey of corporate data responsibility. And there was some very interesting data in there. So some of it is obvious, but at least we now have some numbers that we can attach to it. So 97% of those in the survey believe that data privacy is important. We all know that intuitively, but when you look at those numbers, it essentially says that virtually everyone has this as a major concern. And then the KPMG survey also found that 87% thought that data privacy was a human right. And that's quite dramatic, because when we think about human rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, maybe food, shelter, some of the really fundamental aspects that I think are universally thought of. Now, at least based on survey data, we see that people are beginning to think that data privacy also fits into that category. So that's, to me, very interesting. And then, certainly looking at the COVID-19 environment, we see that in that survey, 75% of the people said that data privacy is even more important to them now in COVID-19 than it was before. Again, we all know the reasons. Everyone is online now. Everyone is far more intensively using digital devices, digital networks. But now, clearly, I think people are more sensitive to data privacy issues. So the way I always start is let's at least look at some data, see if we can begin to sort that out. What's interesting is that this tends to be more of the American view. The American view essentially puts up a wall, or at least a divider, between users and companies. And the idea is that companies are out there collecting all your data, using it, storing it, possibly selling it. Again, if you had a European view, you would not necessarily say that it's just companies. You would also say it's government, or it's not-for-profits. So let me give you a quick example from California just to illustrate that. So the California Department of Motor Vehicles obviously collects enormous amounts of data. Anyone who has a driver's license, anyone who has a car registration or vehicle registration is in the database. And clearly, a lot of information is collected. Anyone who has a registration or a license knows that. You need to obviously have your identification in terms of your height and weight, your eye color, your address, whether or not you wear glasses or have some visual issues. So there's a lot of information that's stored, including visual images, because obviously there are pictures put on there. So there's a very large database. But here's what has happened in the past 6 years. California, the DMV, has decided to not only use the database in the way that you would think, which is to issue licenses and registrations, it's decided to generate revenue from that database. And so it's begun to sell that information that has been collected to third parties. It's sold it to credit bureaus, to private detectives, to other database companies. And yet no one is really, or very few people are really aware that this is done. So there's no transparency because it's the government, and certainly nothing in the new law, the CCPA, would prevent California from doing it. And the new law doesn't even require the California DMV to tell anyone about that as well. So I tend to be a little more sympathetic to the European view, which is that data is data, regardless of whether it's generated or used by a private company or government or a not-for-profit organization. Obviously, we now are in political season, so there are all sorts of solicitations going on for donations and other aspects. That information is being collected by those organizations. Many of those are not obligated under the law to tell you that they're doing it. They can freely sell it or store it, do a variety of things. And that's because there are no restrictions on it.
That's amazing that we live in a country where that's the situation. Even in this country, they pay close attention to every donation that you make. That's all kind of information that people can have access to, and that's why the case of the Postmaster General is so interesting, because the accusation is that he bundled a lot of donations to the GOP. That's how he got the job eventually. But then he reimbursed those folks from among his employees, and that's of course against the law if that's what happened. So this is all being tracked all the time. And let's take a look at who's watching, and everybody tell us your questions. Please ask Stuart anything. This is the spirit in which we do these shows, so that we can all learn together, because I'm certainly learning a lot. Don says, live from New York. Jonathan's watching from the Eastwood Village. He's watched 182 straight episodes, wow, which is incredible. Fernando's watching from Los Angeles, and I know your son is there as well. Oh, my daughter. Your daughter's there. So we're thinking of everyone in California. As you know, Stuart, California was one of the first places to shut down, especially Northern California. But for a variety of reasons now, California is one of the places we are paying close attention to. Rahajan says, hello, everyone from Long Island. And Charles Cunnan Carroll, Mary and Charles are watching from New Jersey. Thank you for watching. They're one of our sponsors, and we'll be doing our sponsor shout out in just a minute.
And I'm a New Jersey native also.
Yes. Excellent. And Gabriela says, hello from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Have you been?
I have, and I know Gabriela. We're both Eisenhower Fellows. And she's an extraordinary leader in Argentina.
She is, and I had the chance of having a wonderful lunch with her here in New York. What do you miss about New York City now that you don't live here, Stuart?
Well, this is pre-pandemic New York City. So I lived in New York City, obviously, before the pandemic hit. And, of course, the energy, the bustle, the centrality. I mean, one of the big things I miss is Broadway. I'm a big theater fan, and I love the ability to go to the theater, live theater. Obviously, there are great sports and great other things, and obviously it's a great restaurant city and a museum city. So there's everything I miss about New York, but I also miss a number of other great cities I've lived in. I've lived in Chicago and Los Angeles and Boston and San Francisco. So I've hit a lot of the major urban centers in the United States.
I've had more than 300 guests on this show, not counting my other shows. I don't think I've ever met someone I've had a guest who said they've lived in Chicago, LA, New York, San Francisco. It's like you're collecting the great Boston, you're collecting the great cities of the U.S.
Right, in Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. We should have you do your own ratings and guide to all of these cities. Right here in New York, we are worried about the restaurant scene. One of the things we saw, a stat that came out, that 65% of restaurants in New York say they will have to close if they don't get more federal aid in the next before the end of the year. Otherwise, they will have to close, and that's really scary. We have seen many restaurants make it through so far, and thanks to the takeaway and the outdoor seating opportunities. Our family has been socially distant, sitting outside, but that'll all have to change when the weather turns, as you know. And last I heard about Broadway, they were dark through January. And I don't know if you've heard anything further since then, or anybody watching has.
No, I think that's right. I also was a museum president in New York, and so I'm very concerned about museums as institutions. Obviously, you could do a certain amount digitally, but many museums, and I know you've been involved in museums for years as well, many of them have physical aspects to them, and certainly the amount of money that's needed to keep up the physical aspect of the museum is enormous. And obviously in the pandemic period, it's very difficult to generate any real revenues for a museum.
It's true. We should give a shout out to your former institution, what was known then as the Museum of Television and Radio and is now known as the Paley Center. I remember when I was a graduate student at Columbia, almost 3 decades ago, so excited to learn there was a place in New York City where anyone could go in and watch almost any piece of television that had ever been, any piece of American television that had ever been put together and produced and available. And you could sit there. It's like the Library of Congress of television. And then it became the Paley Center. So if you want to just talk about that experience and what that was like.
Well, it wasn't just Americans. So we had a collection which I guess was started including radio. We had, at the time I was there, about 140,000 hours, and we had it from over 70 countries. So it was a quite extraordinary collection in terms of materials. But then, of course, like any collection, you have to figure out what do you want to do with it. It's not just a matter, you can certainly have people come in and view it individually, but as a museum, you want to think about ways to curate, ways to do exhibitions and other programming. Probably one of the things I was most proud of is a special collection that I initiated, which was called She Made It. And She Made It was 2,000 hours of programming that had been produced or written by women. And so often when we associate women in television, we associate it with the people in front of the camera, whether it's a Lucille Ball or an Oprah Winfrey. But it turns out in the history of television, there's been an extraordinary contribution of women in terms of writing, in terms of being executives. And no institution ever really collected all of their work and more critically, showcased their work. And so we took this collection. We worked with, obviously, a broad group of scholars and other people in media to figure out who we wanted to be part of that collection. But that was a wonderful curatorial exercise that we went through, which I think had some lasting impact, because I think for the first time, people began to recognize that there's a lot of diversity in terms of figuring out who's been involved in the behind-the-scenes aspect of media as well as in front of the camera.
And here we're looking at the website, December 1st, 2005, She Made It. Women Creating Television and Radio, a 3-year initiative celebrating the achievements and creative and creative and business women in the television radio industries. And that looks awesome. And there was a big reception and all of that. And then you had a series of symposia around this, 2006, Women Directing Television, all of that. What did you learn being over your tenure? What did you learn about the industry? What did you learn about American creativity, being the president of now what is called the Paley Center for Media?
Well, obviously, the United States is just extraordinary in terms of having produced so much great media for such a long period of time. I mean, what I also was very interested in is not just looking at the American side of television and radio. It was not called the American Museum of Television and Radio. And so I took that very seriously to try to figure out ways to do some comparative, to let people, if they walked in the building, understand that there were other types of television and radio programs that would be quite interesting. I remember, for example, the Prime Minister of Finland came. She was at the United Nations, and she requested a visit to the Museum of Television and Radio. And she was very close with Kofi Annan's wife, and Kofi Annan was the Secretary General then. And so they arranged to have the President of Finland come, which is very unusual during the week that the UN is taking place, for her to essentially take about 2 or 3 hours out of her time. And I hosted her personally, but I tried to figure out, what are we going to show the President of Finland that might be interesting? Obviously, we didn't have a lot of Finnish programs, but that's not really what she was interested in. So I met with my curators, and I decided to show the Nixon-Kennedy debate. We curated a lot of footage from the debate, some of the pre-debate materials, and she thought that was very interesting because debates in Finland were just starting at the presidential level, and she looked at that almost as a way to educate herself about how to do a presidential debate. So there was a great cross-cultural moment. She was just sitting there in awe, and she wanted to spend some time afterwards. I thought we were just going to show the videos and then have her escorted out, but she then came to my office and we spoke for about an hour talking about that. This is the famous president of Finland, you may remember, who looked very much like Conan O'Brien. She had a big shock of red hair, and Conan, in fact, went over and did a week of shows with her. She had a really great sense of humor and just was a terrific person. So that was another very memorable aspect.
Yeah, if you Google Conan and Finland, you will see the red hair and both of them there together. It said Conan O'Brien goes full Finland, and you could see that. Folks, you're listening to a conversation with Stuart Brotman, the former president of the Paley Center for Media, as well as the author of a terrific book about privacy, and we'll talk more about privacy in just a few moments. And I will also ask him the question that I know many of you are wondering: which was the golden age of television? Are we living in it now? Was it the early 2000s or the 60s, 70s, 80s? So he'll give us that answer as well. So Stuart, I'm going to thank our sponsors. You understand, having worked in television,
I do.
Of that, and it'll give you a chance to catch your breath and also to share or reply on Facebook to your friends as well, and let them know we're live right now, also on Twitter and also on LinkedIn. So we'll bring you right back. Folks, thank you so much for watching with us, and let's thank our sponsors because we wouldn't have a show without them. So we want to start by thanking our friends at Unbelievable, divinely delicious cookies on a mission. 20% off with the code SREE, SREE. Each handcrafted cookie provides a meal for those in need. One cookie equals one meal. You don't want to miss a chance to check them out at nunbelievable.com. We're also grateful to our friend Charles Cunnincarroll for The Inventor in You, a step-by-step guide to your first invention by Charles, the developer of more than 80 patents. He's at Inventor Charles, and guidetoinvention.com is his book. You want to check that out. We're very grateful for his support. We also want to thank our friends at Muckrack Academy, Fundamentals of Social Media, a free on-demand certification course that they helped me put together. More than 4,000 people have taken that course, and you get a free certificate at the end of it. And this is what the certificates look like. As you can see, people are posting about it. Anka and Edem saying that they've taken the class, and great course for every social media user. Great social media course. So everyone check that out, mrac.co/social. And we also want to thank our friends at oneshare.world, the Interdependence Summit, Thursday, September 17th from 9 till noon. Register now at oneshare.world. Oneshared.world. You can see world-famous speakers like Renee Fleming, the singer, and David Nabarro, the WHO Director General Special Envoy on COVID-19. So we are in the middle of our conversation with Stuart Brotman, whose new book is called Privacy's Perfect Storm, Digital Policy for the Post-Pandemic World. He is the author of this book. He's the Howard Distinguished Endowed Professor of Media Management and Law and the Beaman Professor, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and he's a fellow at the Wilson International Center for Scholars. So big thank you to Stuart for being with us. I hope you got a chance to catch your breath as well. Everybody watching, please share this with your friends and family. You know you're learning a lot, and they should learn as well, and they can watch it live or watch it later. So let me get back to that question. Tell us, when was the golden age of television? Are we living in it now, or is it just past? You tell us.
Well, we're in the era now called peak television. So there has never been more television, and there probably hasn't been more quality television than there is now. So we are in a very special moment in time. And part of that, obviously, is because now television is no longer just a broadcast medium, no longer just a cable medium, but so much of television now, or what we think of as television, is streaming media. So I believe that the largest amount of Emmy nominations this year went to Netflix, which is not ABC, NBC, or CBS, or any of the broadcast networks, or any of the cable networks. It's a streaming network. And so Netflix and obviously Amazon and Hulu and a variety of others, which are doing original programming, are contributing to this phenomena of peak TV. And again, I think virtually everyone is watching TV in some form these days. And the quality is quite extraordinary. You have people who typically would not have done what was conventional television before, who are now doing series, people who would not write for it or direct. So that all of those barriers essentially have broken down. And to some extent, television has become a more prestigious medium as a result of all these new technologies. So I would say today is the golden age. It doesn't mean that there's only one golden age of television. The early part of television essentially was an adaptation of another medium. It was taking things that were on radio and trying to see if you could add visual elements to them. And so that was a major shift. And then, of course, there was the idea of taking things which had been live theater and bringing them into a studio. So much of what was done in the 1950s were these live dramatic productions. And that was quite revolutionary, to be able to stage a theater performance in a studio with multiple cameras. I mean, we saw that now today, for example, with Hamilton, which is on Disney Plus, but that essentially brought that same technique of multiple cameras to a theatrical environment. And of course, now it's just a wonderful production, which everyone can see on streaming video.
Thank you for that. Do you want to give us a few of your favorite shows right now?
You mean currently?
Yeah, currently. What should we absolutely watch?
Well, I tend to be a big fan of the HBO documentary series. I mean, there are a number of great HBO series that are out there. One that I'm watching now is called The Vow, which is a very interesting series dealing with a cult group called Nexium, which was in the news for many years, and now I think is coming up to sort of the final chapter of a sentencing of the person involved. But that's been a great documentary. A couple of years ago, many people may remember the documentary The Jinx, which was a 6-part documentary, very dramatic, very interesting. So I really like those type of documentaries, and not just on HBO. They're just a variety of others. Another one I'm watching now is a documentary series on Showtime called Love Fraud, which is a 3-part series. And that's essentially about a con man who gets a number of women to marry him and then essentially drains all of their life savings, and then he moves on to another place. And so it's a really interesting program to see, the damage that's done, but now the drama of it is there's a bounty hunter who is looking for him along with some of his former wives. And the drama that's building is whether or not he's going to be caught, and obviously what's going to happen afterwards. So there's a lot that I love on television.
Those are great recommendations. One observation is that I watch a lot of HBO when I can, but recently HBO went to HBO Max, and somehow I can't find it on my smart TV anymore. So I've just given up. So I want to watch the movie about the series about if Charles Lindbergh had the alternate history of America.
Yeah, the plot against America.
Yeah, if he had become president and what that would be. The other thing I noticed today, I don't know if it caught your eye, is that Reid Hastings, the one of the founders of Netflix and co-founder and CEO, he said that his competition, when he was asked, what is your biggest competition? What do you worry about the most? He didn't say Disney. He said YouTube, TikTok, augmented reality, those kinds of things are what keep him up at night more than worrying about all these other streaming platforms. And you said peak television. Do you think that we could have even more than now? Like, would it peaker television? Is that possible?
I think so. Obviously, peak television is a term that was coined by an executive named John Lanscraft, who's the CEO of the FX network, which is owned by Fox. But he was really referring to the commercial aspect of streaming video and the networks and the cable networks. When you incorporate YouTube, which I watch a lot of YouTube, and there's extraordinary program on that's also television. And obviously, there's a lot of interesting programming that's being created and uploaded to YouTube. So clearly, we're almost at the level of infinity in terms of television programming. And I forgot what the statistic is, but it's a quite dramatic statistic for YouTube in terms of how many programs are uploaded daily on an hourly basis. And so YouTube, as you know, just continues to expand. I get to watch many of the shows I would have watched at the Museum of Television and Radio. So I was just watching the 1956 Steve Allen show yesterday, which is just quite interesting. It was, I think, his second show that he had done, and it was the show that had this new singer named Elvis Presley on. So it was the first time that Elvis Presley ever appeared on television was with Steve Allen, and you could just Google or put in YouTube Steve Allen, Elvis Presley, and you'll be able to watch that show. It was quite interesting because Steve Allen really didn't take Elvis Presley very seriously, and he had him sing "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog" to a hound dog, and he made a comic sort of skit out of that. And Elvis Presley seemed quite uncomfortable having to sing that to a dog. But it's a really interesting piece of video, so I encourage people to take a look.
Well, since you mentioned it, here it is. let's take a quick look. You're right. He even has a hat on.
Right.
So let's hear what he says.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never put a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, I started you in high class.
Anyway, everybody gets the idea of that, and they can all search it.
Right, and that's probably not the Elvis Presley that most people remember.
And that dog really couldn't care less. He's holding the dog's face and singing to him. In terms of Reid Hastings and his comments about all these other kinds of other ways of being entertained, do you see one of them standing out? In terms of like YouTube and augmented reality, TikTok, and also so strange to see TikTok caught in this enormous global political, it's become a global political football. And poor Kevin Meyer, he was in line to maybe have, he was already a top executive at Disney, as you know, and then he when he didn't get the CEO role there, he left to join TikTok, and
right.
now he's left that because he didn't expect this to be what he was doing, trying to save the company from a forced sale to, of all things, Oracle or Microsoft. Like, you couldn't make this stuff up, Stuart.
No. Well, I think we sort of have divided the world in our heads, similar to what we do with sports. So there's the world of professional sports, and there's the world of amateur sports. So people may love pro football, but they also may like college football or basketball, you name the sport. And I think television is quite similar. I think we have what would be called professional television, that is professionally produced and written and has a sort of a level of quality to it that we expect in the way that we expect professional athletes. And there are also amateurs, and that's TikTok and YouTube. And so clearly, I don't think you necessarily have to choose between them, but there is this separation between the professional world and the amateur world. And what's interesting about Netflix, or at least Reid Hastings' view, is he thinks he's playing in both of those arenas. Typically, someone would play in the professional league or play in the amateur league. He also is playing very vigorously in the professional league. So his company now is spending about $15 billion a year on original production. And just by a point of comparison, HBO, a competitor, is spending $5 billion a year. So he is putting enormous amounts of money from Netflix revenues into original professional production. And I would have to imagine that decision is based on, a competition with HBO and some of the other services.
Just to understand, when I first heard the $6 billion number for Netflix a few years ago, I couldn't get my head around it.
Right.
And I learned that included obviously a lot of international programming and also just buying up content like an arms race and stocking it to keep, say, HBO from getting it. And now you're telling me HBO is spending $5 billion. That is so much money, because until they went streaming, they had a limited amount of things that they could show. And that's a heck of a lot of money for programming, a lot of it original. And that's all good news for creators.
It is. And that's why you needed a company like AT&T to acquire Warner Media and HBO to be able to essentially pump in that size budget for original production. HBO on its own didn't have that.
All right. Since we both worked at museums, I thought we would share this post that I had written back in 2015. I was asked, what is the biggest competition of the Met? Is it the Louvre? Is it the Guggenheim, MoMA? And I would say no. The biggest competition is not other museums. It's Netflix, Candy Crush, Life in 2015. And I don't think that's changed. Our problem wasn't that people were going to too many other museums. People weren't going to museums enough, right? I would say go to any museum. It doesn't matter. Just go to a museum. And I'm sure you felt that way too when you were running the Museum of Television and Radio. Let's see some of the other people watching. Apollo, who usually lives in Vegas, is watching from a train in Colorado where it's snowing. Even though there were record temperatures in Colorado 2 days ago, now it's snowing, and he's on his way to New Jersey. Do you have a story about Vegas that is family friendly that you can share with us?
I do. It'll take a couple of minutes, but I think I can sort of compress it. So one of the things I've done for a number of years is serve as an expert witness in litigation. And about 20 or so years ago, the Justice Department decided it was going to break up the movie chain in Las Vegas because it said that movie chain was essentially violating the antitrust laws. It was preventing other movie companies from coming into the market, and under the law, that's considered monopolization. And so the Justice Department sued this movie chain in Las Vegas to have them broken up. And that went to trial. It was a major trial. It was not a jury trial. It was a judge trial that, in fact, was done in San Francisco. So when I signed on to become an expert in the case, one of the things I had to show was exactly what we're saying now, which is that people don't think of just going to the movies as their source of entertainment. People watch movies in a variety of different ways. And so the old notion of monopolizing movie theaters probably was an antiquated notion, because people could wait for that same movie to be on HBO, or at that point they could go to Blockbuster and watch it. So there were a variety of different ways to do that even then. So about 2 months before we were preparing for trial, the counsel who was representing the movie chain said, "I have a special request for you." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I'd like you to go to Las Vegas, and I'd like you to go to a movie in every movie theater in Las Vegas. And I want you to do that in the same way that any patron would." So I basically went on a 48-hour movie bender in Las Vegas. I watched a movie in every movie theater in Las Vegas. I paid my admission. I generally got a popcorn or soft drink. I went to the bathroom. I did all the things that someone would typically do if they were going to the movies. And I had no idea why I was doing that. But obviously, I was retained to be an expert, and this was a request by counsel. Fast forward about 2 months later, when we go to trial, I'm on the stand testifying, and essentially they turned over part of the cross-examination to a younger lawyer from the Justice Department. And the younger lawyer, unfortunately, sort of stepped into the giant hole that you never want to have if you're a lawyer, which is asking a question that he didn't know the answer to. And so he asked me somewhat sarcastically, Mr. Brotman, you claim you're a big expert in this field, but have you ever actually been to Las Vegas and watched a movie in a movie theater there? Well, obviously I had. But not only that, but I had memorized every aspect of every one of the theaters in Las Vegas. So I then spent 3 hours answering that one question. So I would answer it by saying, let's talk about, let's say, Theater X. This is what the ticket booth looked like. This is the price of admission. They had Dove bars. They didn't have butter for the popcorn. They had artificial butter. The bathrooms were filthy. And that was, for me, it was obviously a wonderful moment in terms of a trial, but it was one where I always have this memory of flying into Las Vegas and spending really 48 hours going to the movie theaters there and learning them in a way that probably no one else ever had.
I've asked dozens of our guests about their memories of Vegas, but yours is, I think, one of the more unusual ones. A lot of the other stories have a lot of stories about bars and nights that have gone awry, but yours is also memorable. Thank you. Brian Schulman's watching on LinkedIn. Have a great show. Always love seeing you. Voice your vibe, he says on LinkedIn Live. Pradnya is watching from Silver Spring, Maryland. You lived in the DC area. Did you live in the city or in the suburbs?
No, I've always lived in the city, different parts of the city, but I know the suburbs, and obviously a number of people live in the suburbs. And Washington has grown just not only in terms of population, but geographically. The greater Washington area really almost borders on Baltimore now. And so it's a great area now.
My parents lived in Bethesda. My dad was the deputy Indian ambassador to Washington, and he and my mother announced to everybody that they're moving to Vienna, and people were underwhelmed and not impressed at all because they thought they were moving to Vienna, Virginia. They were moving to Vienna, Austria, and so people were like, "So what's the big deal?" People move from Springfield to Arlington to Bethesda, like they move like that, but not often to Vienna, Austria.
Yeah, and of course, the worst part, obviously, over the years is what's known as the Beltway congestion, but it's a really difficult city if you're in these outer suburbs now to drive in if you don't have access to public transportation.
The train system, it's small but very efficient when you want to get to the airport, and I wonder how things are going now over there. Mark is in Durham, North Carolina. Tell us memories of the Research Triangle. I'm sure you've been.
I have, and I have wonderful current memories. As I mentioned, I'm an Eisenhower Fellow, and there's an extraordinary group of Eisenhower Fellows who live in the Research Triangle area. And so I'm constantly in touch with them. Every year, but not this year, they have an Oktoberfest party. And it's been quite extraordinary. I've never actually been able to go, given my schedule. This year, I had intended, obviously before COVID hit, I said this will be the year that I will go to the Oktoberfest party in Research Triangle. Obviously, it's not going to happen, but I think it's just a wonderful area. I have a lot of colleagues and friends at a number of the universities, people in government and elsewhere there.
2021, Oktoberfest, North Carolina. Watch out. Stuart Brotman's on his way. We should I should also say that since we talked about Elvis and the fact that you're in Tennessee, we should make that connection. You're in Knoxville, Tennessee, great university town. My last trip, apart from Florida, before the pandemic shut me down, was to my first trip to Tennessee, to Chattanooga. Wonderful little city and great food. I had some wonderful meals before I got shut down. Let's see, lots of people are tagging their friends, and I hope you'll all do that. Tag your friends so they can learn. Mark says, privacy has been a major issue in the African-American community because of the way activists were targeted against their privacy. I'm thinking of Black Panthers, Martin Luther King Jr., and I would even argue current members of BLM. What are your suggestions for people who want to be able to be activists and speak out, hold truth to power, speak truth to power, but are worried about what might happen to them for jobs, for grad school, for university applications? What are things that they can do?
Well, we really have three different concepts that sometimes get compressed into privacy, but I think of them as separate and related. So I think this question really relates to surveillance, and typically government surveillance by law enforcement or others, which obviously can affect someone's privacy, but also can be independent of invading your privacy. As I said, we have surveillance for motor vehicles, for car registration. I don't think anyone really objects to that. That's part of the process. We have that for voter registration as well. So the other aspect that people sometimes put in the privacy basket that I think is separate and related is cybersecurity. So we certainly want to have networks that are secure, and that contributes to better privacy. And obviously, to the extent that surveillance is limited to necessary functions, that also protects privacy, but they're somewhat separate. And so I would try to maybe peel the onion a little bit in discussing that. What I often say is I think the fundamental issue here, whether you call it privacy or cybersecurity or surveillance, the issue is digital trust. And we have various aspects of digital trust in society. I think most of us trust, for example, medical records. And this is obviously something now in COVID-19 with telehealth for people who are being examined or diagnosed remotely. I don't think many people are saying, please do not send my medical records or look at my medical records when you're doing a remote diagnosis. So we have a high level of digital trust. Anyone who is buying something through e-commerce, which obviously has exploded in COVID-19, most people are buying with a great deal of digital trust because they're putting their credit card number in, they're putting in their delivery address. There's a lot of information that's being added. And yet, digital trust, I think, is quite high. That is a contrast to, I think, what the person just asked, which is this notion of not having a lot of trust in terms of having certain information surveilled. One of the really critical areas now for discussion is what to do about a new technology, not all that new, called facial recognition. Facial recognition essentially can capture your image, your visual image. It can reduce it to digital information that could be stored and sent and sold and communicated. And it's been primarily been used by government sources, by law enforcement. And so now there are a number of communities in the United States, most prominently San Francisco and Oakland, California, and then also a number of communities in the Boston area, including Cambridge and Somerville, which actually have mandated a moratorium, have said to police and other law enforcement, you cannot use this technology for the reasons that I think were being suggested in that question, which is that that contributes to a greater amount of surveillance. And so far also the technology has shown that there's a lot of false identifications that are being done, and some of those false identifications are disproportionate to minority communities. So obviously that raises the stakes for those communities in terms of law enforcement and surveillance.
And that's certainly something that I think we're all paying more attention to. We just have a few more minutes with Stuart Brotman. Jonathan says, I'm sure I'm in one data bank or another. Pradnya says, would love to hear Stuart's thoughts on WeChat and data collection by the Chinese government. You can throw TikTok in there as well. And where do you stand on your understanding of the Chinese government and tech?
Well, that's become a major issue, obviously, because President Trump has essentially ordered that TikTok, which is owned by a Chinese holding company, that TikTok needs to be divested. And part of that is a suspicion that a lot of the data that's being collected by TikTok is being used by the Chinese government. And obviously, there are national security implications to that. There are trade implications. So this has been a really interesting period because usually these type of issues were not raised in terms of having outside technologies potentially affect the privacy of Americans. I mean, we certainly have had Skype, for example, which was originated in Europe, and Skype has collected a lot of information, but that tended not to raise any national security concerns. I think by virtue of China being an authoritarian government and having the ability to use the information in potentially very mischievous ways against the United States, I think that raises the stakes.
And we'll see how that plays out. My mom's watching in Kerala, India. Hi, Amma, love you. Thank you for always being there. LinkedIn says, why can't Americans have a Euro-style data privacy? Our own government is the worst offender.
Well, as I mentioned, part of policy formulation is to sort of set aside government and to focus on the private sector companies. I think a lot of people have really been focused on big tech and how big tech essentially can collect and use information. And once you really focus the spotlight on big tech, it means that you tend to not focus on other aspects, as I said, like government, the not-for-profit community, the political community. So there are a number of other institutions that are collecting data. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to essentially deal with this all in one piece of legislation. I mean, clearly, I think the private sector has some obligations and is beginning to recognize those obligations. And again, we see the data. We see people when they're surveyed who say, we think that the private sector needs to step up more in terms of protecting the data. And it's not just protecting, it's also transparency. I think people want to know, how is this data being collected? What is it being used for? And in California, what we've seen are a number of interesting innovations. There is something called the Do Not Sell button. So literally you can press a button which will instruct that the information on a particular website that's being collected, you as an individual are not granting access to have that information sold. It can be used by the company. Obviously, that's part of the business model. But literally, by pressing the button, you are saying, I do not want to have that information sold. And the law mandates that these companies provide that button for people to do so.
Where do people see this button?
They typically, if you go on a website in California, you'll see a Do Not Sell button.
And only in California that you can see this.
Well, it's interesting because the law protects people in California, but it affects California residents. And so it's sort of a gray area at this point in terms of how California residents are protected when they're not in California. And so right now that hasn't really been resolved. What's really interesting is that in a few weeks, Election Day, California is actually for the first time putting this on the ballot. What I described before, the CCPA, that was a piece of legislation that was passed. Now there's a ballot initiative which is going to the voters. So that would essentially put this to the test of an election process to see whether people in California really want to vote for this. And the new Proposition 24 would essentially enhance the existing law. So that's something to watch in the future. The other aspect is that California is not alone. There are now about 20 other states that are looking at legislation in this area. And so far, very little progress has been made for federal legislation. There seems to be a stalemate between Republicans and Democrats in this area. There's also been very little interest by the Trump administration in trying to push this legislation through. So I think the election, the presidential election, may have some real implications for whether or not we have federal legislation going forward. Obviously, that might be affected by the composition of the House of Representatives and the Senate.
Voting matters, folks. Mark says, so many folks are using Google Hangouts, WhatsApp, I'll put in Zoom to communicate with family. How concerned is your guest about these kinds of communication tools as far as privacy is concerned?
Well, what I've advocated, and of course there's part of the book that discusses this, something called privacy at the kitchen table. So one of the byproducts of COVID now is that we're all at the kitchen table. Family members are sitting around with their devices, and for the first time, we're actually getting to see how our family members, people very close to us, are using all of this technology and the types of information they're getting, types of databases they're accessing. So I think this is a wonderful time. It's a moment in time, a good aspect of COVID-19 for us to begin to have these kitchen table conversations, to ask your spouse or your partner or your kids, how are you using this information? And to also tell them how you're using that information. It's also an enormous intergenerational opportunity because all of a sudden we have parents and grandparents living with their kids now. And many of those people are not digital natives, but they're living with digital natives who can help them protect their privacy through password enhancement, through two-factor authentication, through a variety of different means. And the way they do that is you sit around at the kitchen table and there's teaching and learning that could go on within families. So I really recommend that right now we use the opportunity to begin to have these kitchen table conversations. We have the conversations about work and about healthcare and about education. And clearly, as I said, we see the survey data is that 97% of people think this is a really important area. So I would argue that that should be another topic for a kitchen table conversation.
Nice. And I hope people will take you up on that. We're talking to Stuart Brotman, author of Privacy's Perfect Storm, Digital Policy for Post-Pandemic Times. We just have a couple of minutes left with him. I don't think we even have that, but lots of comments coming in here. Rahajan says, I'm a huge fan of the Paley Center. And so many more comments coming in. Rahajan says, thank you, Stuart, for appearing on this informative program. Blessings to you and your family. We appreciate that, Rahajan. Daryl says the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has been leading the charge to protect the free internet. Where do you stand on this issue?
Very complicated. I'm not sure we're going to really have that much time at this point, but there was something called net neutrality, which was a major movement in this country. The FCC essentially enacted some rules in the Obama administration, which mandated that essentially internet service providers could not discriminate in terms of the data that was being sent. That has been reversed now in the Trump administration. But on the other hand, the authority to oversee this has gone back to the Federal Trade Commission from the Federal Communications Commission. And that actually, I think, is a pretty good thing because the Federal Trade Commission really has expertise in this area. Federal Communications Commission regulates communications, but doesn't have a lot of expertise in privacy enforcement. So what net neutrality gave in terms of non-discrimination in terms of networks. It also took away in terms of the ability for the Federal Trade Commission to enforce it. That now has been flipped. So it's sort of a mixed bag. Big question, obviously, post-election is if you had a change in administration, would that administration try to go back to the Obama administration rules, which were the FCC, and whether or not the FTC would lose or have its authority minimized?
Well, one reason to have a new government in Washington is to get rid of Ajit Pai, but that's another story, and that's a personal note here. I think that he's been one of the most ineffective and, well, effective in helping out the big companies, but in terms of protecting the individual public citizen, I think he's done a terrible job, but that's another story for another time. Stuart, before we let you go, any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with us, apart from everybody buy Stuart's book? It's called Privacy's Perfect Storm, and it's for private, how to think about public policy in dealing with the internet and all kinds of digital issues in the post-pandemic age. So, Stuart, over to you.
Well, I try to practice what I preach. And so obviously I'm involved in discussions. My wife is here. And so we discuss digital privacy, and I discuss it with my kids. So I think this notion of privacy at the kitchen table is an interesting one. And I'm really trying to promote that because I think there's so many interesting conversations that people can have at that level now that probably are not going to exist sort of in the post-pandemic period where we all go back to our different residences or our different workplaces. But now is the time to begin to talk about it. And now is also the time to begin to use those discussions as a way to talk to policymakers. Very few policymakers actually are thinking about what's happening at the kitchen table. They write legislation, they argue, they talk to lobbyists, they talk to the people in the radius that I discussed around Washington. But I was very surprised that in the presidential debates and any time that a person is campaigning for Congress, virtually never do you hear anyone ask a question related to digital privacy, and virtually never do you hear anyone during a town hall stand up and say, here's a personal story that I have about how my digital privacy has been affected. I think we need to have that as a national conversation. And when I say national conversation, I don't just mean the United States. I would subscribe to having that all over the world.
And I certainly hope that people will follow up on that. Thank you so much, Stuart. We're so grateful to you for your time, your insights, and look forward to having a drink with you in New York in 2021.
Absolutely, and we'll watch more of Elvis.
Yes, yes, we will. Thanks very much, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Pleasure. Take care.
That was Stuart Brotman, and wasn't he fantastic? Look at Kevin's comment. Good show and podcast. Mark loved the old radios in the back that Stuart collects, and I'm sorry we didn't get time to go into those. But before I say goodbye, we have a couple of administrative things to take care of, and just to tell all of you, thank you so much for watching. Please go to YouTube and hit the subscribe button. We'd love to bring you in so that you can see more of our shows and look at our archives. 6 months every single day, high quality guests. Not always as good as Stuart. No, I'm just kidding. We always have a good guest, a terrific guest in Stuart's case, and we're so grateful to everyone who makes this show possible. Please send us your suggestions for speakers, for folks who should be on the show, for themes that we should explore. We're going to be covering more politics as we get closer to the election season now. Someone told me, as you may know, that Labor Day is the start of the election campaign, the official start of the campaign. And I feel like we've been in election mode for 2.5, 3 years. And so I don't know how you get even more election oriented, but we will. And this Saturday, I just found out that someone that I've been talking to for a while to be a guest will be here. SV Date will be here. He's the White House correspondent for the for Huffington Post, and he got into a famous back and forth with the president, or not back and forth. He just asked a question that a lot of people will remember. Just a couple of weeks ago, he asked the president at a press conference sitting in the White House briefing room. He said, "Do you regret all the lies you've said to everyone over the last few years?" It was quite a dramatic moment, and I'm glad he asked that question. We'll ask him about asking that question. He'll be here 9 a.m. Eastern time. Yes, a rare Saturday morning appearance, and he'll talk about his book about Trump as well. So thank you all for being here. One of the things we always do is we asked Kimberly Crenshaw, the great Columbia Law School professor, what should we do to be allies of the African American community? And she said, say their names. And so we have been saying their names in different ways. Our friend Rajan, who watches the show, compiled a wonderful list that he and I are going to talk about how we can make it so that we can read it every day in a way that makes sense and people can understand the scale of the problem of police violence, white supremacy, and other things. So thank you, Rajan, for that. For today, we are going to say their names by looking at the list that was put together around say her name. And first, I want to show you this Titus Kaffir cover of Time magazine. You see the blue glove of the pandemic on the left, and then on the right, Larcinia Floyd with her son George. She would die 2 years to the day that he would, almost to the day that he would be killed in Minneapolis. Now they're buried together in Houston. And here's a list. Say their name. In this case, say her name from the Say Her Name report. Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, Charlena Siobhan Lyles, Corinne Gaines, India Kager, Sandra Bland, Alexia Christian, Maya Hall, Megan Hockaday, Janisha Fonville, Natasha McKenna, Tanisha Anderson, Aura Rosser. I'll ask you something that I tell folks all the time. You know some of these names because they've become household names, but how many names do you not know? How many names have you never heard of? How many names have you had a chance to look up? Shanique Proctor, Michelle Cousseau, Pearlie Golden, Gabriela Navarez, Yvette Smith, Renisha McBride, Miriam Carey, Chaim Livingston, Kayla Moore, Shelley Fry, Melissa Williams, Shulena Weldon, Alicia Thomas, Chantel Davis, Charmel Edwards, Rekia Boyd, Cherise Francis, Aliana Stanley Jones, Tarika Wilson, Katherine Johnston, Alberta Spruill, Kendra James, Latanya Haggerty, Margaret Laverne Mitchell, Taisha Miller, Danette Daniels, Frankie Ann Perkins, Sanji Taylor, Eleanor Bumpers. Thank you for joining me in saying those names, and thank you for your thoughts as we think about this country and where we are today. I'm always grateful to everyone who watches this show, who has called this show a lifeline, who says this show is helpful to them. The show is helpful to me and is a lifeline to me. Thank you so much to our wonderful producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31, and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon, for their terrific work on the show. Every day we have a guest because they put in the effort. They do the production, and we're so grateful to them. And we'll have a whole week of episodes this week at 9 p.m. Eastern, except Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern. And we'll also look for a way to mark the 9/11 anniversary. Thank you again for being with us. Let's thank our sponsors. We want to thank Nunbelievable, Divinely Delicious Cookies on a Mission, 20% off with the code SREE, S-R-E-E. Please check out nunbelievable.com. We're also grateful to Charles Cunnan Carroll and the book The Inventor in You, a step-by-step guide to your first invention. Charles is the developer of more than 80 patents at Inventor Charles, guidetoinvention.com. And we want to say hello to our friends at Rise or Fall Together, the One Shared World Interdependence Summit. It's a free global world-class conference that you don't want to miss. Thursday, September 17th, 9 to noon. Please register right now, shared.world, oneshared.world/live, oneshared.world. And we want to thank everyone who has also taken our course on Fundamentals of Social Media from Muckrack Academy, and for me, free, on-demand certification course. Enroll today, mrac.co/social, mrac.co/social. You get a certificate like this. Why not do this? A good pandemic project for you. I learned a lot putting that together, and I know you will as well. Lots of great comments coming in from folks. Holly's watching from Albany. Jonathan's watching from the East Village and says thank you. And Apollo, you're on the train, Apollo. I want to hear all about that train ride and what that's like, Vegas to New Jersey. Thank you for an awesome show here in La Junta, Colorado, illuminating and unnerving to think how exposed Americans' digital activities are to those with the means and powers to conduct surveillance. Thank you, Vandana, Rose, Neil, and your team. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. And we want to say thank you and look forward to seeing you soon. Please email me if you have any questions, sree@sree.net and youtube.com/sreenet, and just hit that subscribe button right there.